I know I was born for this. I know I was born for this. Don't care for the critics, my words are like physics, a force that they can't stop. They just don't get it, I think they forget I'm not done till I'm on top. I know I was born for this. I know I was born for this. I believe we can write our story.
Hello, everybody. How you doing? It's Gary back here again. Words from the Wise, Wise Leadership Solutions. Happy to be here. Looking forward to having I think one of the most important conversations I've had yet on the show. Today's guest was, in a lot of ways, one of the most important people in my Navy career, and I don't know if he knows that. And I'm looking forward to talking to him about that because I think it's in this life it's rare that we actually get the chance to catch up to the people that we actually really positively affected. This man uh, changed my life, and I'm gonna get him on the stage so we can talk about it. And I'm happy to introduce him to y'all. He goes by the name of Mr. Brian Nelson. So Brian, what's up, man?
Not much. Not much.
All right. So Brian, man, bro, I don't know if you remember, uh, but when I got orders to a float training group San Diego, I was not supposed to come there and be a damage control guy, right?
No.
I was supposed to come there and be anti-terrorism force protection.
Uh,
Do you remember
oh,
that?
yeah.
You and so I was a quad zero. Something that meant I had never been to school as a damage controlman, no NECs. And on my ship, I had gotten qualified force protection training team because I'm a first class trying to make it work, right?
Right.
And I make chief, and they cancel my orders that I had, and they tell me I'm going to ATG. And I was excited because like, cool, I got to go ride ships, learn how to be a better DC guy, right? And they're like, no, you're gonna go do force protection. It's like, oh no. So I literally walked to ATG one day as a chief off the Ogden. And I
Right.
went to the building and I was like asking around, like, where do the damage controlmen sit? And they pointed me upstairs. And I went up there, and you were there, right? And I had just got the orders, like literally just got the orders. And I was so like I knew I couldn't go do force protection. I knew I had to go do damage control. And I went up, and you were there, and you and I had a very quick conversation. But it was just I told you what was going on. I told you what I was worried about, and then you said, "Well, as a matter of fact, there's a guy who just got orders to ATG from SEER, and he wants to go to force protection." And that was Rupp, Ryan
Rup.
Rupp.
Rup.
And you said, "Well, I'll see what I can do." And the rest was history, man. Like I don't even know how it worked, however you did it. But when I got to ATG to check in, I went upstairs to damage control, and Ryan went to force protection, and that was it. And I tell you, bro, I look throughout my life, and you probably have had similar moments now where you look back on your life and there's just key people at the right time, at the right place. And I look at it as God giving me an opportunity to work with someone to do the right thing, right?
Right.
And you was that guy at that point in time, bro. If you hadn't have been there, if you could have been like, "Hey, bro, I don't know you, and you got to go to ATFP. I can't. You quad zero. You can't ride ships as a DC chief. You ain't never been to no school." Because people might have could have raised the fuss, right? People could have
Right.
raised the
Right.
fuss, and but you didn't do that. And so, bro, thank you, dog. Thank you.
Well, I think at that time, the Captain Diefenbach, he was our head of the engineering department. So, me and him, we had a great relationship. So I just went and talked to him, and he went to the the director of training at that time, and he talked to him, and he just made it happen. Yeah, based on my recommendations on, you just coming off a ship and the other guy being at SEER. So, you've already been through, most of the training and stuff. So just because you was a quad zero didn't mean you didn't have the, the technical ability to perform the job. So,
Right.
that's kind of what I conveyed to him, and yeah, we just made it work from there.
Bruh. I mean, makes sense to me. Makes sense to me. And
Yeah,
it worked out for both me and for Ryan, right? Because
you're right.
Ryan was very successful at ATFP,
Yes.
right? And he went on to do great things on his career. And I think we all got taken good care of. And I can't wait to get to ATG. But before I get to that, we got to go back, man. We got to go back in the time machine. So, right, did you grow? Right now, you're in the great state of Texas, right?
San Antonio, Texas.
San, are you originally from San Antonio area?
No, I grew up in a small country town about 5.5 hours away from San Antonio. Um, I'll give you the closest city because once you get beyond that, you probably won't recognize the name, but I'm about 45 minutes from Beaumont, Texas.
Beaumont,
So
Texas.
once
Okay.
you get past Beaumont, you're really getting into the sticks. Yeah.
Okay.
And I could give you another town which it it's got a bad stigma to it because of what happened there. Jasper, Texas. I don't know if you remember. There was a guy named William Byrd that got drugged behind a pickup
Oh,
truck.
I did hear about that. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So Jasper, Texas is a little. I'm only about 30 minutes from that
Right.
part of town. Yeah, but yeah, I grew up in a
Mm.
small country town, country boy. You know, went to school, graduated, never left the country until I joined the Navy.
So, okay, so growing up in that country town, right? Uh, before we get to you joining the military, how was it for you? Was it good country? Was it good community, good people, or did you feel like it really it wasn't where you wanted to be, and that's why you joined the service?
Back when I was growing up, there's a lot of racism going on down in that part of the world.
Yeah.
Uh, I'm also closer to Vidor, Texas, uh, and I think everybody knows a little bit about Vidor history. But there was nothing going on in that town unless you were going to be in the logging industry. That's what my dad did. Uh, his life is he was out there, cutting wood and doing that type of stuff. So there was
Right.
nothing there. I mean, when I graduated high school, I worked with my dad for a while because eventually he became a carpenter, and I worked with him for about a year doing that after high school. But I was like, well, this is not my cup of tea either.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's where I went. I originally was going to the army.
Okay.
Um, yeah, I pretty much did everything except swear in, and I had three cousins in the army already, and they was like, "Well, what did he offer you?" I said, "Combat arms." They was like, "Definitely not." So I went to the Navy recruiter after that, and that's how my journey began in the Navy. Now, knowing what I know now, I know that Army recruiter was really probably upset because he lost the quota.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
hey, I had three cousins that was already doing that type of work, and they was like, "Yeah, you don't want that." So yeah.
When you were in high school, were you like into sports and stuff, or were you like more like were you working with your dad, so you really didn't get into the extracurriculars? What was the kind of stuff you were into in high school?
Yeah, I didn't do too many sports. We didn't grow up with all the luxuries.
Okay.
So I did a lot of work with him on the side. So I mean, of course, we got to do the little activities during school.
Right.
What they call throwing washers right now. You got that board they make with the three holes, and you throw the washers in them. We were
Okay.
doing that. We were doing that in high school, but we just had a hole in the ground. You know, now they
Yeah.
making big money off of those boards, you know.
Right, right.
Yeah. So yeah, other than that, no extracurricular activity in high school except for, coming home, homework, and going to work with daddy. Yeah.
Okay. So were your cousins from the same town you were from, or were they from like somewhere else?
Oh no, we all grew up together.
Okay.
Yeah. They were just older. Yeah.
So, I mean, you saw people join the service to move on, to get out of there and go do something else and to get opportunities. What did your parents think when you talked to them about joining the service, or did you even tell
Oh yeah, I told them they were for it. Especially my dad. He was like, "Well, son, there's nothing here for you.
them?
So, if that's what you want to do, go ahead and do it." Because my younger brother, well, I wouldn't say younger, he's a year younger than me. He joined the Air Force before I joined the Navy.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, because like I said, I stayed out a year and worked with my dad. And once he graduated high school, he went straight to the Air Force. So they were very supportive of the decisions that we made as far as trying to, get a better life than what we grew up with.
In your family, was it just you and your brother, or do you have more
No,
siblings?
it's five of us.
Okay.
Yeah, my older sister, she just turned 60 yesterday.
Oh, happy birthday to her. Yeah.
She actually went into the Air National Guard when she got out of high school. So she was part of the military, and I'm next to the oldest, and then my brother that went in the Air Force. Then I have a sister under him, and then my baby brother. He was also in the Navy. He did about 6 years, and he got out.
Man, do you know this is so common? Families that have people that join the service, you
Yeah.
see multiple people from that family join the service because they see that it's a reasonable option, right? It's
Right.
not because some people think about joining the military and they're just like, oh my God, why would you do something so crazy?
Right.
But when you got people like cousins or brothers and sisters, you recognize it's not that out of the box and
Right.
it's actually not a bad deal, right?
Right. Yeah.
Um, so, but your family sounds like there's a lot of service there, so that's something to be proud of, right? Y'all
Yeah.
represented, y'all
Yeah.
represented to the fullest.
Yeah. Now, most of my cousins, none of them actually did 20.
Okay,
But, once when I go home and talk to them, and, they're like, man, I wish I'd have stayed in and just, finished that
yeah.
20 out. Yeah.
Oh, I
But I mean, for some people, I mean, it's not. Maybe they wasn't cut out to do 20. You know what I'm saying? Uh,
life, man, and I went recruiting as a third class on a very very fortunate thing, and I remember when I was a Navy recruiter, I never met one person over the age of 40 that was glad they got out after 4 years. Now, all the young people I met at the junior college, they was all
right.
talking their stuff. I'm so glad I'm out, blah blah blah. But the
Yeah.
older generation, they
Right.
all was like, "Stay in, don't get out. Stay in, don't get
Yeah.
out." And I
Yeah.
will tell you now, at my my ripe old age of 48 years old, I
Right.
would really talk to people about understanding the investment
Right.
that you're going to give up if you walk away, right? Because it's something to think about.
Right.
Um,
Right.
for sure. All right. So when you go to the Navy, so your cousins tell you don't get into combat arms with the Army. Did you not think like Air Force? Did you not think like Coast Guard? Was the Navy just the next recruiter in line?
Yeah. I mean, basically, it was the next office next to the army guy.
Yeah. Bro, that happens so much, man. Like people, they look at the doors in the hallway and they decide, okay, I don't want to shoot at people. The next door is the Navy, and they
Yeah.
go in the Navy, and
Yeah.
and that's it. All right. So when you went to the Navy, do you remember going to MEPS to the military processing station?
Yeah. And actually, in my little small town, I had to go all the way to DeRidder, Louisiana, to find that's where the Navy and the Army recruiting office was.
Okay.
And I remember my recruiter was a master chief.
Whoa.
Yeah, yeah,
Dang.
yeah. So, once everything was said and done and MEPS, I had to go all the way to Houston, which is 2 hours away from where I live.
Right.
Yeah, that's where the MEP station was down there. Uh, that was an experience down there. I mean, I don't know if they still do this today, but when I went to MEPS and they did all the physical stuff, and you had to bend over. And I was
Yeah.
like, what's going on here?
Look, man, not only do you have to go through that experience, I remember when I went to MEPS, the big deal was I got a hotel room,
Yeah.
right? Like by myself. I had never had no hotel room by myself at that age. I can only imagine you coming from your town to Houston
Houston.
in a
Yeah.
hotel room, kind of by yourself, right? Looking out the window, like, dang, that's Houston.
Yeah, seeing all the lights, and I'm like, man, this is what the city's like. Whoa. Yeah.
For sure. I mean, look, a lot of us, when I first joined the Navy, my first airplane was when I first joined the Navy, my first hotel room. Like it was the first, it was the opening of the door to
Right.
what was to come, right?
Right.
When you got offered your jobs at the MAPS, did they offer you multiple jobs or they just offer you one? How'd that go?
Yeah, I mean, there was multiple, but I kind of got stuck as a undesignated fireman. Yeah.
What was that pitch? How'd they sell that to you?
Yeah, it was like, hey, we got all of these great options here, but you know, as a fireman, you can do almost anything you want on the ship. So I'm like, oh, okay, yeah. I said,
Yeah,
not knowing anything, I was like, well, that sounds good to me.
right, right.
Yeah. So
Hey, same thing for me, bro. Well, truth be told, I had a little bit of a record, so I was told that I could only pick from undesignated airman, seaman, fireman. But they also told me it's like going to college and not picking your degree right your degree right away, and you get to
right.
try things out, which we know that's not
No,
that's not really how
exactly.
it works.
Yeah, yeah.
So, what month did you go to boot camp?
I want to say it was in August.
August. And did you go to like Orlando or San Diego, or did you go to Great Lakes?
Oh, I was in San Diego in that heat where we had flag days. Yeah.
Yeah, Black
Yeah.
Flag. And
Yes.
it was the heat in San Diego different than Texas?
Oh, most definitely. Texas heat is like none other. I
Okay.
mean, our summers down here, they're brutal. Yeah. So San Diego was kind of like a walk in the park, but it was still hot. Not
Yeah.
a lot of humidity
Right.
like here in Texas. Yeah.
Yeah. That's the big difference, right? San Diego, and they got that breeze right off the ocean,
Yeah.
right? Whereas in like Florida, Texas, they'll bake you. It'll bake you, right?
Yeah.
San Diego will fry you. It will, it
Yes.
will, you'll get fried. You'll get a sunburn like no other in San Diego, right? Okay, so when you went to boot camp, what was your initial reaction? Like do you remember the day you flew there? Like, were you with other people?
Yeah, we all flew there. We got to San Diego, got over there and they took us all off the bus. And uh, I remember we met, there were some other recruits already there, some
Right.
senior people, and we had this one guy, that he was trying to tell us what the real deal was. And he was making himself out to be the guy, the leader, you know. So we was like, okay, but it was kind of scary, getting off
Yeah,
that bus and not knowing what was going to happen. And
for sure.
yeah, and pushing us through the clothing line to get clothes, and then the vaccines, and
Right.
all of that good stuff. Yeah, but yeah, it was a eye-opening experience. I can say that.
So at the end of boot camp, because it goes pretty quick, right?
Yeah,
When you get there, it's scary and it's all this new change, but
yeah.
it really does go pretty fast. Looking back on it, was it what you expected, or was it something else?
I think based on me dealing with my cousins, they kind of told me a little bit of what was going to happen and stuff. So,
Okay,
yeah, it
yeah.
wasn't too far off from what they said. So,
Well, what year did you go to boot camp?
woo, 86.
Damn, bro, that might have been like fourth grade, bro.
Yeah,
Man, again, what a different place the world is today from 1986,
86. Yeah,
right?
yeah,
I mean, it's incredible how different the world is today. The mid 80s, bro, there was no technology like today. You know,
exactly.
it was not like that. And so you didn't have a lot of access to information to prepare for what was coming, right?
Yeah.
You didn't have all that. Okay, so you graduate boot camp. Where was your fireman school? Was it in San Diego?
Yes. Well, not really because back then, when you was undesignated, once you finish boot camp, you do a little firefighting stuff in boot camp, and I was sent right off to a ship.
Okay, so you got because I did undesignated. It was like a 3 day school, so there was like nothing. I agree.
Yeah.
What ship did you go to first?
The USS Midway.
The carrier?
Yeah, the one I retired on.
Dude, that was your first ship?
Yes.
Bro, how was that? Go walking. How was that? Go walking on the pier and looking at that big ship.
Again, country boy. Never left the country. Went to San Diego. Now I'm in Japan. uh, Going to this big ship, getting on the ship, and it was like, man, this is what I'm gonna be on. For the-
Bro, let's reel that back real quick because I must have a fleet guide too. How was that coming off the airplane in Japan the first time?
Man, that was nerve wracking, especially, and I think we landed in Narita Airport.
Yeah,
Yeah, so it was like, hey, where do I go?
right.
How am I getting down to where the ship is? But luckily, they had a bus and they kind of shuttled us all to the bus,
Yeah,
and shuttled us down to Yokosuka, to the ship.
yeah. You
Yeah.
just kind of you just kind of follow the other Americans off the
Oh
plane.
yeah, 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 yeah. There was still
Oh,
there was some more because they had there was a person there at the airport, waiting for us because there was more people on the plane that was actually going to Yokosuka to different ships.
yeah.
But yeah, it was a
So
little nerve wracking.
that's a long travel day,
It
right?
is.
Did you get to go home on leave first to go back to Texas?
I did go home for a little bit
Yeah.
and then flew. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, because they know once you go to Japan, you're not going to be home again for a while,
Oh
right?
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So you get there. Did you get to the? So it sounds like you got to the ship at night then, because after that long travel day.
Yeah. Got there at night. The next day, you know, they gathered all us firemen and they put us. We went to the engineering department where we met
Right.
the chief engineer and the DCA, and it was like seven of us. And they was like, "Well, we gotta send some of you guys down to the engine room, and we're gonna send three to the engine room, and everybody else, you guys are going to our division."
Right.
Uh, so I was one of the lucky ones. Went to our division. uh,
So when you went to our division on the Midway, was that because on my aircraft carrier, the DC-men and the HTs and the MRs were not in the same division, right? Because we were the damage control division. But on the Midway, were they all in the same division?
yes, it was all our division, but you either went to the DC side or the HT side.
Okay.
So I went to the DC side, and some of the other guys that came with me went to the HT side of the house. Yeah.
So when
So
you get there, 1986, we're talking OBAs,
yeah,
right? H+F stations.
yeah,
Uh, Halon was a thing, right?
yeah.
Uh, and CO2 flooding and APC, right? All that stuff and
Right,
repair locker gear,
right.
right? So what was your first shop you was in? Do you remember?
I was in the DC shop. That's what we called it.
Okay.
So we pretty much did it all. We did the watertight door hatches. Um, we did the maintenance on the OVAs at the repair lockers, the all the AFFF Halon stations. So yeah, we had all of that.
So it wasn't, you guys didn't have multiple damage control shops. You just had one shop that kind of
One
did everything.
one shop. That's it.
Do you remember what was there a DC senior chief, or was there HT senior chief, or how was that?
There was a HT chief on the HT side, and we had a DC man.
A DC chief?
Yeah.
Okay.
And we had some old grumpy first classes. When
Well,
I say old, I mean they were old now.
were they the DC men that converted over to DC from like being HTs and then the rate came back? Would you
Well, see, back then that the DC rate when I got on the carrier, the DC rate wasn't established. It was already gone. So everybody there were HTs pretty much.
okay?
Uh, so soon after that is when they bought the DC rate back.
Right.
And they got us all in the hangar bay, all the HTs and DC men, and they was like, hey, who wants to be a DC man and who wants to be a HT? And so they was like, if you want to be a DC man, go this way. You want to be a HT, go this way. So I just stayed where I was, because that's
Yeah.
what I knew.
Yeah.
And that's how I became a DC man. Yeah.
I tell you, it's a big culture shift whenever you start up a rate or they reestablished it because there
Establishing the
was
rate.
DC men and they
Right.
got rid of them and they brought
Yeah.
them back. Okay. Did you feel like as a young fireman there was enough people to do the job of the DC men on that ship?
Oh yeah, we had plenty of people. We had enough people
Okay.
to go out and do all the work that was there. Uh, Now, was it divided fairly? I would say not.
Right.
Because they had their favorites that they would let do whatever they kind of wanted to do, and everybody else is picking up the slack. So
Yeah.
I mean, in
Talent
that
management,
sense,
man.
yeah,
Yeah. People just don't know how to handle people. But
right,
I would tell you, I watched the damage control community go from at least my generation to when SCBAs got introduced and just the 3M program, it became
yeah,
so much PMS, bro.
yes,
Like it was
yeah,
out of control. And so I was wondering what it felt like on the midway. And then did it get to
yeah,
be just it became more and more and more and more and more, right? And
yeah.
we'll talk about that. But I would tell you as a damage controlman, we got to be good at 3M, at PMS, right?
Oh yeah, yeah,
You're not good at that, you're gonna get in trouble. You're gonna
yeah,
get in trouble.
for sure.
Okay, so what was your first GQ assignment? Your first battle station assignment? Do you remember that?
I think I was in Repair Locker 7 Alpha.
Okay.
Yeah. And back then when we had inspections, it wasn't ATG way back in the day, it was FTG, Fleet
Right.
Training Group. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I was the CO2 man. And you know, back then in the day, when you getting inspected by FTG, you come up on the scene with the CO2 bottle, you gotta, hey, I'm the CO2 man. I have a 15-pound CO2 bottle. This is the range. I keep it
Yeah.
grounded. It's been you had to give a whole spiel, and once you gave that spiel satisfactory, they let you go.
Right.
Yeah.
That was I had that same job, man. I was on the overhaul team and I was the CO2 man. And like you, I'm not very tall, but I'm strong. Like they knew I
Yeah.
could carry the damn bottle was almost as big as me.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm carrying it up and down ladder wells. No, so
Yeah.
I get it.
Yeah.
And yeah, they want you to verbalize it because
Yeah.
that way they know you know
No.
what the things are, right? Yeah.
Right. Exactly.
Uh,
And
do you remember your first deployment on board Midway?
well, being in Japan on a ship, you forward deployed.
Right.
So yeah, we was always gone. And but I do remember the deployment. We went off. Man, we hit a lot of places. We went to Australia, um, Thailand. Uh, you know, lot of those foreign countries. Which again, country boy. Hey man, life is good,
Yeah.
outside of the country, but we had to anchor out all the time. So, we had to catch them Liberty boats back and take them out and catch them back. And, that's the day when they coming on the ship and we exchanging our money for their money. So,
Yep.
yeah, deployment was good. Deployment was good.
Yes, definitely overseas tour, especially before 9/11. There was a lot of ports to go hit, a lot of places to go see. Uh, those Liberty boats can be a little treacherous sometimes.
Oh, yeah. But I'll tell you that during that Asian time, you had Liberty cards. If you didn't
Yep.
have a Liberty card and you also had a PQS qualifiers card, if you didn't have that, you wasn't going on Liberty.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, you had to earn
And
it. Liberty was a privilege, right? And
yeah,
leave was a right. Remember that?
yeah, yeah.
So, when you look back on your first ship, did you have any strong mentors or people that you looked up to?
Yeah, I would tell you that the once I got there, there was a guy there. He was already a third class. Uh, you probably know him, Abraham Bryan.
Okay.
Uh, he was at my retirement. He's a warrant officer. But yeah, he kind of took me under his wing and kind of showed me the ropes. And me and him were out doing maintenance. And other than that, I would have to say not the first chief that we had, but the second senior chief, the senior chief that we got after that.
Mhm.
He was just coming off of a fleet training group, and he got orders to the Midway. And I'll never forget that guy, Jimmy Stewart. Um, yeah, he was awesome. That guy, he taught us a lot. I mean, all of us that were in the division. Yeah.
What was it about him in particular that makes you remember he was really good? I mean,
I
besides the fact that he's a senior chief, because y'all
yeah,
y'all was probably proud you had a senior chief. You had a
yeah,
DC senior
yeah,
chief. What's up?
yeah. Well, I think mostly the way that he was one of those that he believed in. This was his theory. When we out to sea, we gonna work hard. When we get in port, we're gonna play. And he stood up to the chain of command. You know, when he felt that something, hey, we don't need to do all of this. This
Right.
is this is unnecessary stuff that you got us doing. And he believed in taking care of the people.
Yeah.
Um, and not letting us get walked all over and letting him get walked all over. But overall his outlook on how to treat people, you know with respect. And yeah,
Okay. So you did 3 years on board the Midway?
I did. Well, no, I did two. So back then we could do split tour.
Okay.
So I did 2 years and then I transferred. Uh,
Did they offer you the chance to extend on the Midway?
I could have stayed. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So how come you chose to leave?
Well, I think I had pretty much did everything I wanted to do on board of the ship. I made third class, there.
Okay.
Um, so I was kind of ready to come back to the States.
Okay.
Really. Yeah.
I mean,
So
that's a good reason. I get. I mean, back in them days, there's no cell phones to call home. You writing letters, and you
yeah.
might get a calling card or whatever it is to talk for like 20. It's like being in jail, right? You on the
But
phone,
yeah.
and it's like you
Yeah.
have 60 seconds left to finish up your phone call. It's like that.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah. So I did the 2 years on there, and then I left there and came to San Diego.
And to another ship.
Yes. I came from Midway and I went to USS Germantown.
Oh, that's a transition.
Yeah.
Yeah, because the Gator Navy is no people don't know the Gators is
Yeah.
tough time for a DC man.
Yeah. But when I got to the Germantown, there was already two other people that was on the Midway with me that was already there. Yeah. Yeah. So, and Germantown was probably only 4 years old at that point when I got on her.
Okay, so you got to Germantown, had some people that you knew, so sponsorship was better. Uh, Midway, you lived on the ship, of course. Germantown, you lived on board the ship too.
I did.
Okay,
Yep.
how was that? I mean, I understand living on board the ship in Japan, right? I mean, that just makes sense, especially when there was no barracks back in the days. How was it living on the ship in San Diego, knowing that like if you could go get a car because you couldn't get a car in Japan,
Right.
right? Did you buy a car when you were on the Germantown?
I did not. Man, no. I stayed on the ship and, I didn't get a car until probably after I got off the Germantown.
Okay,
Yeah.
so you just kind of stayed in the same operational mindset then of what you
Yeah.
was in Japan. Okay.
Right. Right.
Um, how different was it the workload or the shop size from what you had on the Midway to Germantown,
Oh, reduced a whole lot. I mean, we
right?
still had a lot of equipment to take care of, but it not near as much as what we had on the Midway.
Right,
Uh, so still we had the DC, we had the HTs, and we had the MRs. We had MRs on the Germantown. So
right.
uh, yeah, uh, a lot less maintenance, but same type of equipment.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you probably got your hands on a lot more sewage on the Germantown than you got your hands on or were you not having to deal
No,
too much with the sewage?
no, we didn't.
Okay,
The HTs took care of all that. We
okay.
just kind of maintained our DC equipment and stuff. We didn't mess with any CHT. Um, Only when we maybe pull it into a port, they might have us manning like the pump room or something.
Yeah.
So that when we get hooked up and hook up on the pier, but other than that, if there was any other problems with CHT, we didn't deal with that.
So really just like sounding a security watch, checking the pump rooms and
Yeah,
training for the H2S leaks and all that stuff. But the
right,
H okay, that's good. How about so when you're on the carrier, you would see the air wing come on with all the aircraft, right? How much
right.
different was it seeing the Marines come on the ship versus the air wing?
uh, Man, all the Marines like to do is stand in the child line and and hog up the gym. Uh, but I'll tell you, being on an amphib and doing LCAC ops and all that, and seeing them bring that equipment on, it was like, man, we really ready for war here, you know?
It is.
Yeah.
I've done both in my career. I'm a Gator guy. I've done 3 Gators, but then I did a carrier, and I love Marines. I actually give Marines a lot more grace than I give to the
Yeah.
Air Wing. 'Cause the Air Wing is sailors. Like, they supposed to
Right.
know better. The
Right.
Marines, they kind of fish out of water, right? You can't
Yeah.
shoot the water, bro. You
Right.
gotta trust in us. We'll get you there,
But
you
I
know?
tell you what, though, on the Marine side, discipline was was there. you know,
Yeah, they don't play.
uh, yeah, yeah.
They don't play. They do
You
not play
know,
that. Yeah, no, I love the Marines, man. I do. I think, especially as I became a chief and I got to work with the gunnies and like the
Gunnies.
upper class, they're solid, bro. They are some
Mhm.
good leaders
Yeah,
for sure. Um,
definitely.
what was ballasting like on board the Germantown? That had to be a new experience for you? Was there push button mevacs, or did y'all have
Eh,
to crank on the stations?
No, they had push button.
Okay,
Um, Now with the ballasting, of course, we had to go around and open certain hatches, and certain ones had to be closed, and we had to go sound the ballast tanks and do all of that good stuff. But yeah,
yeah,
yeah, I mean, back then I'm a third class, so I'm doing the grunt work. I
right,
wasn't really up in ballast control, but
right.
yeah, it
Just
was
kind of the
all push
rover.
button though. Yeah.
Out of your first two ships, you remember like a big casualty that you got to be a part of? You remember your first like big damage control event? Was there one?
On the Midway, we was in the Philippines. We was tied up to the pier, and they was like, "Hey, we got a typhoon coming. We got to get underway." So we got underway, and we ran right into the middle of the typhoon. We lost a lot of the Mark V life canisters. We
Oof,
lost antennas. We had some doors that lead out from the hangar bay to the sponson that had warped that we had to shore up.
right.
Uh, yeah. So other than that, I mean, on the Midway, we didn't really have. That would probably be the only one that I can attest to.
Okay.
We had to put our shoring skills to the test,
Right. Right.
and get those doors and stuff shored up. But then right after that, we had to pull back into the Philippines to the shipyard to get all of that stuff fixed. Um, but and the Midway, it was based off a battleship hull, and they put blisters on the Midway to kind of keep it, balanced out.
Right.
Uh, but that didn't work too well.
So she rode poorly in the storm.
No, for sure. Yeah. We had, and back then on the Midway, we had a Mardet detachment on there that pretty much all they was there for was to protect the captain, and yeah,
Right.
hit that storm, everybody there was getting sick.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's a pretty bad storm when people on an aircraft carrier getting seasick.
Yeah. Yeah. But yeah, nothing really on Germantown. No
Okay.
real major events that happened on the Germantown.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
So you're in San Diego. You're from Texas originally, country. How much different is San Diego than Japan as far as being a sailor? Are you getting out in town more, or did you enjoy Liberty in Japan more than San Diego?
I would say Japan back in that time was good. I mean, we
Hmm.
hardly ever stayed in Yokosuka. We would always hop the train and go to Yokota, or we go up to the army base in Camp Zama.
Hmm.
Uh, yeah. Um, I mean, we would go up there and kind of hang out.
Right.
Wasn't too much to do. Everybody was in Club Alliance down there in
Right.
Yokosuka,
Yeah.
or out on the hunch. So we would just veer out and go to the Air Force bases and to the Army base. Yeah,
Right.
but Liberty was good there. San
Okay.
Diego, it was. I can't knock San Diego now because after getting into the swing of things, it was good too.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, but
yeah,
Southern California, right? Southern California in the late 80s. I used to tell sailors when I was on Ogden, like, look, I don't care where y'all come from. That's really Southern California outside that gate. You
yeah.
go out there and act a fool, them and all their cousins are coming to talk to you. It's not a game, right? You go to Barrio Logan, you might find
Yeah,
some problems, right?
yeah,
You go to
yeah.
that Plaza Bonita Mall, start acting a fool,
Mm,
you might have a
yeah.
problem.
Oh yeah, yeah,
Did you
yeah.
remember? were you going like downtown to like the club areas, or were you going to Tijuana, or were you just like going to people's houses and stuff?
Man, I'm gonna tell you, when I first got from Japan to the States, we went to Tijuana. And like I said, it was some people that was already there that,
Right.
you know, and the guy he drove down there. It was about four of us. You know, he was a Puerto Rican guy, and we drove down to Tijuana one morning. We went to one little pub, had one beer, and we left. As we were leaving, we got stopped, and the little policeman said, "Hey, y'all ran the stop sign." So all of
Mm,
us get out of the car and say, "Well, what stop sign?"
right.
And yeah, there was no stop sign. And he said, "Well, I'm taking everybody to jail." I was like, hold on. So I said, "Hey, Chico, man, you." That was his name, Chico. I said, "You got to go speak some Spanish to that guy." I said, I got duty tomorrow. I can't be in jail."
Yeah.
So he went and talked to that guy, and we all had to end up paying that guy uh, so that we could go free. That was the
Yeah.
first and the last time I went to Tijuana.
For real. It was
Yeah,
it was shady business, bro. Going down
yeah,
to Tijuana. It really was. And look, and like you coming from Japan, you've been to all these other third world countries and had a good
right.
time, and ain't no
Yeah,
one ever took you down, right?
yeah.
Because they like the sailors and over in the Pacific because we bring a bunch of money to their economy, right?
Hmm.
But Tijuana, that's a hustle for them, right? And it's all
Yeah.
they symbiotic. They got the Americans going back and forth, and yeah, I'm not surprised to hear that story, man. I'm glad to hear you got out of it, right?
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. Just imagine, man. I'm in jail. Yeah, well, all four of us in jail. Like, oh
Yeah.
no, no, this is not good.
Hey, it's so bad that down there they used to have sailors stationed on the border just to
Yeah,
go because they would not be surprised, right? They go get you. But then sometimes the Mexicans wouldn't even tell America that they had you for a little while, trying
right,
to get
right.
you to want to pay because there's an ATM machine and go get some money.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah,
All right. So you're at the end of the Germantown time. Are you thinking about getting out of the Navy?
yeah. I mean, initially, yeah. My thing was I was only gonna do 4 years and roll out,
Okay.
but I had such a good time on Germantown. Um, they actually wanted me to extend on there. Um, and I was like, well, no, I'm ready to move on, you
Yeah.
know.
Well,
So
yeah. What makes us different going overseas our first tour is typically a person will do like 4 years straight on their first ship,
yeah, yeah,
right? We get the chance to, like you said, do 2 years here, do 2 years there. And that's kind of nice. That's a nice because 4 years on one ship's a
right,
long time.
yeah.
That's
And I think another reason that I wanted to go ahead and get off of there is, you know, I knew I could transfer, and I was talking to it was an NC1, and back then they were the one negotiating with the detailers, and hey, can we transfer this guy? And he just kept giving me the runaround,
mhm,
and I was just getting bad vibes from him. So one morning early, I called the detailer, and he says, "Yeah, And I told him, "Hey, the NC1's been trying to call you." He said, "I haven't got a call from that guy."
right.
So yeah, I kind of got my own orders, and
Yeah.
yeah, uh, and I left there, and I went to. Where did I go after that? I went to Naval Air Station North Island.
No kid, right
I,
across the harbor.
yeah, I did short duty, physical security.
That was a very typical damage controlman do it,
Control.
right?
Yep.
That was very common. I would that's a hard job, bro. People don't understand how tough physical security could be. Because
Yeah.
you was a gate guard?
Yep. Gate guard, patrol. Yep.
Yeah.
Had to
Sure.
come to I actually came back to San Antonio over at Lackland to go through the school for the 90 whatever that NEC was.
Yeah.
Yeah. 9545, I believe it is. And you know, went to that school and then went back to North Island for. Uh, I was there for 3 years.
Yeah, it's a very common damage control shore duty, right? And it was a lot of seagoing rates. That was a shore duty because back in those days there wasn't MAs like a whole army of MAs.
Right.
Um, did you like that? Did you like that tour? That because were you doing that 3-2-2-3 rotation?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
did you
Yeah.
like
No,
it?
it was. Yeah. It was. It was pretty good. You know, that's where I met my wife. So.
How,
Yeah.
how'd you meet your wife?
Oh man, she was in the Navy.
Okay,
Um, she worked out at the weapons compound at North Island, and we had a gate there because they would bust them in, like, well, those that stayed in the barracks,
right.
they would bust them down to the compound, and you know we had to get on there and check all their IDs and stuff. Yeah,
Mm,
so kind of how
okay,
I met her. Yeah.
nice. Were you a second class at the time?
I was second class when I got to North Island, made first class there.
Okay, how was that studying for the advancement exam while doing physical security? Was that stressful?
Man, that was just like, whoa. Some of that
Yeah,
stuff was foreign, you know?
yeah, you out of rate,
Yeah,
out of
yeah,
rate, for sure.
yeah. But I
Okay,
ended up,
so
yeah.
so your wife, does she decide to get out of the Navy during that tour, or does she choose to keep serving?
No, she got out after that.
Okay,
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, we had a baby, so yeah.
okay, so you leave North Island, DC-1, coming off physical security with a wife and a baby now.
No, we were still at North Island
Okay,
when she had the baby.
right.
Uh, yeah, and right before I transferred out of there, going back to the ship, is when she got out. They, you know, back they gave her the option. Hey, you can stay in or you can get out. So
Okay,
yeah, she got out.
so here you are now. You got what year is that? It's got to be after 2001 now, right? It's got to be after 9/11.
No, that was in
No,
the 90s.
that was in the 90s. I'm sorry. Yeah, you're right. So you're coming at so it's like mid 90s. You're a DC-1, got a family now. Did you think about converting or changing rates while you were on that shore duty?
I did not.
Okay.
And you know, I didn't find out until I got to my next duty station, which was USS Anchorage, LSD 36.
Right.
Uh, and that's when the whole hey conversion to MA, a lot of people were trying to get into the rate.
Right.
Um, I tried when I you know found out about it, and I needed a waiver for like 10 points.
Oh, the ASVAB?
And right, and they was like, yeah, we're not doing any more waivers. Uh, but the real reason was not the waiver. They didn't want any more first classes.
Mm,
Yeah, they wanted an E5 and below. They didn't want any
yeah.
more first classes converting over.
Yeah. Well, because back in them days, you couldn't become an MA unless you were an E5,
Yeah,
right? And they were probably look, that was the hustle. I remember when I was a young DC man, everybody was coming off of that physical security duty, and they
yeah,
was all like, I'm gonna go MA, I'm gonna go MA. Because
yeah,
they got back to the ship and they remembered how much work it was to be on that ship, right? And they coming from that physical security world where it was work, but it's a different kind of work, right?
right.
You're not signing your name on a bunch of PMS checks, and
Yeah,
you're not having to worry. I mean, firefighting is like you said, your first ship, you didn't really do a lot of firefighting, so it's not really a concern about I'm going to go fight a fire. And look, base security is one of the safest law enforcement jobs you'll ever have, too. Let's be honest, right? So
yeah, yeah,
I remember that everybody was all of the ones that did brig duty, physical
yeah,
security, it was always reminiscing. I should have went MA. I should have went MA.
yeah, yeah.
So,
And I
so when
think
you're
at that time, you know, that's what I knew. So why not try to cross over, you know? Because
Yeah,
now
I
I'm
mean,
I'm coming back to the ship and I gotta get back in the DC mode, you know.
so when you come back to the ship, is the anchorage there in San Diego?
Yes.
And was your wife originally from San Diego or no?
No, she's from Pittsburgh.
From Pittsburgh. But you guys had a home in San Diego. Y'all set up in San Diego.
Yeah,
And
we
did
stayed in housing.
okay.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So when you get to the anchorage, you're going there now as a DC1. Do you remember there being a lot of expectations on you right away to be a leader?
You know, we already had two other first classes there. Um, and we had a chief. So yeah, I don't think the expectation was there, but after being there, you know, and watching the performance of the other two, then the onus kind of went to me. And, you know, they looking to me for, you know, leadership and guidance. You know, that's what the chief and the DCA expected.
Okay.
So
Did you get your ESWAS pin on the anchorage?
I did.
Okay. Because that was about the time, right? Like
Yeah.
ESWAS wasn't really a big deal till about the mid 90s. Um, do you remember what was the biggest challenge you had getting put in that leadership role as a new first class when these other two first classes had already been there, right? Was it just you had a fresh energy? Was it you had more potential? Was it they weren't really trying as hard? What do you think was the thing that made you be the one they went to?
Yeah, I don't know how long they had been there at the time, but you know, I think they were kind of burnt out, you
Mm,
know. So, you know, they didn't really care, you know, what happened. You know, they wasn't there to take care of the youngsters. Um, you know, no deadlines were being met. The DCA was always down there. So eventually he made me the LPO.
okay.
So which caused a little turmoil. Yeah, but hey, you know, if you're not performing, then why do I need you in that position?
I get
Yeah.
it, man. When I was DC1 on Ogden, there was 5 DC1s. And the day I got frocked to DC1, they made me the LPO over the other 4. And I was just like, but I'll tell you, was your DCA an LDO?
He was. No, he was a warrant.
He was okay. He's a warrant, right?
Yeah.
My DCA was an LDO. The warrants and LDOs, they don't give a damn, bro. They don't care. They are going to
Yeah.
put the best person for the job in. The Chiefs might play a little bit more like working on giving people opportunities. The LDOs, nope.
Yeah.
They'll drag you behind the shed, shoot you dead, and keep on moving. It's just a different leadership style, man. And that's
Yeah.
that's partially why they become LDOs or warrant officers, right? They're not trying to
Right.
play games.
Right.
Yeah, they're
Yeah.
not. They're not. That's one thing throughout my career as I learned going through the Chiefs mess and looking at the wardroom, the warrants and LDOs, man, they can be cutthroat, and I respect it though because they all about getting their job done. They're not about
Yeah.
playing no games. They
Yeah.
about getting the job done. If you don't want to get the job done, go do something else. They don't even want to see your face.
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
But they had that luxury, right? They don't got to be the chief. They got to try
You,
to get someone to do better and come
well,
back to them.
right.
How was your chief and your DCA? Do you remember? Do they have a good relationship?
Yeah. So we only had a HTC when I got there.
Oh, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay.
So and the DCA was prior HT.
Oh,
Uh, yeah, but you know they were both good.
yeah.
DCA and the HTC. You know, he used to pull me aside all the time. You know, in the HTC and you know give me constructive criticism and you know ways to improve. So yeah, I can't knock those guys because you know they were good.
Well, and like you said, right? Since they were coming up, HTs were running all the DC gear when they were younger. They
Yeah,
just probably stayed HT for whatever their reasons were.
right.
But they knew the job. So you were essentially the DC chief, it sounds like, as a DC1.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. How was that leading a shop full of damage controlmen then for you as a young DC1? How long how long from being physical security until you were the LPO of the division? Was it like a year? Like first year on
Probably,
board?
yeah, yeah,
Okay.
probably about a year.
And
Um,
then for the next 2 years you ran the shop.
yeah, about 2 years, and then we got a chief, um, which didn't pan out.
I
Uh,
was gonna ask. I was gonna ask. I was gonna ask. How did that
uh,
go?
well, you know, in my eyes, I'm thinking, okay, you the chief, you should be grooming me to become, the next chief wherever
Right.
I may go. But this guy, he would leave the ship every day at a certain time, and he'd be like, "Hey, if anybody looking for me, I'm walking up and down the pier, looking for watertight door parts." So I'm like, "What? Watertight door parts? Okay,
Yeah.
whatever." Um, and then he show back up, and I mean, he's leaving around like 10. He'd come back about 2:30, and then he would come in the shop and he was like, "Okay, well, what we got done today?" And I'm looking at him like, "What you mean what we got done? I mean, we got our work done for the day, and where the guys, man, they out doing sweepers because it's about time to get off." And he was like, "Nah, we're gonna do this." I'm like, "Hold on a minute, uh, pump your brakes.
Right.
You've been gone all morning, all day, now you're gonna come back here and try to tell us what to do." I was like,
Right.
"That's not working." So me and him we kind of bumped heads, and he used that phrase that most of them used with me and this other first class we had got. And he said, "Hey, if y'all can't make them do the work, I'll make you do the work." And I'm like, "Hold on, work is done." Yeah.
Right.
uh, and they ended up getting rid of him. um, and of course, when they tried to get rid of him, he tried to pull the race card. uh, so
What was the race card that y'all was black and he wasn't?
well, he was what so he was like from one of those, I wouldn't say a Iranian or Iraqi, or but he was something similar to that, right?
Okay, so he had a flavor to him, like Middle Eastern
Right.
flavor. Okay.
Right, but he was more pissed off at the when they tried to get rid of him. He's going after the upper chain of command, saying that
Oh, okay.
they were racist.
Oh, so
You
he
know,
wasn't coming after y'all. He was
no,
going after them.
he
Wait,
was going after them. But hey, man, you're not here,
yeah.
and
Well, and
we were failing a couple of inspections, and of course he got the blame for it, and but hey, you got to do your part as a chief. I mean, we've done what we got to do. Your paperwork stuff is not in order.
right.
Uh,
Was it the same DCA you had that warrant officer? Or was it a new guy?
no, it was a different DCA,
That'll
uh,
get you.
different
That'll get you.
DCA,
Yep.
and man, it got bad that it had went all the way up to Fibron. uh, and there was a master chief, the command master chief at Fibron. He told his boss, he said, "Look, I know two people on that ship that I could get over here right now and get the truth." One of them was me, because he was my command master chief on the Germantown,
Okay.
Master Chief Nelson.
No relation.
No relation. So yeah, man, I had to go over to the Fibron and talk to the command master chief. So I laid everything out to him, and yeah, when I got back to the ship, the chief come up to me and he's like, "Hey, man, what did y'all talk about over there? What did y'all talk about?" I said, "I'm not telling you what we talked about." He said, all right, you don't have to tell me on the ship. We could talk outside of the ship. I said, no, I don't need to talk to you about nothing that me and the Master Chief talked about over there.
Right.
Yeah. And shortly after that, he was gone.
Well, and I'll tell you, unfortunately, the DC great, right? You're either a really good chief or you're not. There's unfortunately not a lot of in between, right?
Right.
And you get found out pretty quick because that's a ship-wide safety program, right?
Right.
Like people, when I go do all the things I've done throughout my life, the lens I look at everything is always through a safety lens because I
Yeah.
learned that was the best way to help my team win. Remind everyone, we're not just engineers, we're ship
Right.
safety specialists, right? If we
Right.
do our job right, there are no mishaps, there is
Right.
no problems. So our job is
Mm-hmm.
to spin it. And then if things go sideways, we train everybody to respond to that casualty. But
Right.
this guy was taking advantage, and then I hear that the new DCA. What I've seen throughout my career is those new LDOs would get there, and they're not covering up for no weak chief, bro. They're not
No.
doing that. They're not going
No.
for that because most of them was the chief,
Yeah.
right? They did the job, and
Yep.
and in my experience, they either usually get along or like really good, or they
Good.
really
Yeah.
don't. They
Don't.
really
Yeah.
don't. And typically the command goes with the LDO or the warrant officer over the chief
Yeah.
because the Chang is typically an LDO too,
Ooh, yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And the
Yeah.
LDOs and the warrant officers, they are. I mean, they're just like the mess,
Yeah.
right? They got that connection. They're gonna take care of each other. And the top snipe, he may not save you if you not, because they don't usually give a damn about no DC man. I
Yeah.
mean, are you an EL? No. Okay, bye.
Nope. All right. That's it. That's it.
So as a DC one, looking at that whole thing, how that whole thing happened, how did that prepare you for making chief? And did you want to make chief at that time?
Oh yeah, after all the where I started from on the Midway, Germantown, and doing physical security, and then getting to the Anchorage. My thought process is, yeah, I want to make chief because I want to make change. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
I've seen different leadership styles here that were good. I got the bad, so I'm gonna come up with my own style of leadership to where, I'm gonna take care of people.
right,
You don't need to yell all the time to get your point across. But I just wanted to make sure that, hey, you got good people out there and they need to be taken care of, and you got bad leaders that, are just, most of them are out there for self worth.
right.
Yeah. So, yeah, that
Did you?
motivated me even more.
I bet, man. I bet. Did you? Because here's the deal. Like I know, as a chief, if you, as a first class, you just can't get in the door for certain things,
Right.
right? There's just certain conversations happening over lunch in the chief's mess that you're not privy to, that your
Yeah.
sailors are being. I mean, when I was a young DC1, my chief, I had two different chiefs. One hated the DCA, so he would never leave the mess. He would only stand watching the pit and go to the chief's mess, and the DCA ran the DC shop, which
Wow.
wasn't bad, but our chief
Yeah.
was non-existent. And so SOQ boards,
Yeah.
recognition, he wasn't advocating for us for those recognition things. And he was
Right.
a shaker and a mover in the Chiefs mess, but he wasn't doing nothing for the DC mess,
Treatment.
right?
Right.
And then my next chief, he hated the Chiefs mess. Like he wouldn't leave the damn shop. Like he loved being in the shop, messing with us all the time, but
Yeah.
couldn't get nothing done in the mess because none of them dudes mess with him like that, right?
Wow.
We used to call him Chief Kit Kat because they was just like, all you do is eat candy bars. You don't even come in and eat food. You just, And so I learned that there's a balance to both, right? You got to be in the
Right.
shop, you got to be able to work with the wardrobe,
War.
you got to be in that mess and be working with them people to advocate for your people
Right.
was the best thing for the command. So did you make Chief Petty Officer on board Anchorage?
No.
Okay.
And there's a good explanation for that.
Okay.
So I spent 5 years on the Anchorage.
Wow.
Rotation then was 5 and 3.
Okay.
So I did 5 whole years. So I seen a lot of people come and a lot of people go.
Right.
My last year on Anchorage, um, my son, he got sick, and we was getting ready to go on deployment. And the doctor wrote a letter to give to my chain of command that says, "Hey, we think it's best that both parents are here at this time." Uh, so I gave it to the DCA and the chief and the new chief that we got, and we had a chief, we had another first class that was there, and they was like, "Hey, yeah, we support it." So they went on up and ran it up to the chain. He was good with it. Uh, got up to the XO, and he was like, "Well, he need to find some avenues to see if we could get people to kind of help out while he's gone." Mind you, my family's not here in San Diego. Her family's not here. So went and talked to the CMC, and they was like, "Well, try to get with the ombudsman and see if they could help out." Well, we talked to them, and they was like, "Yeah, I mean, we could take food to her, but we just can't sit over there,
Yeah.
with her."
How old was your
So,
son at this time?
shoot, he was born in he was probably about 3.
Okay, so you got a toddler essentially with something significant going on medically
Yeah,
that's probably causing a lot of stress for your wife,
yeah,
and your son is your second child.
yes,
So you got an older child that got to be cared for. And,
right,
and I'm just saying all this because unfortunately our Navy doesn't always do good when it comes to taking care of
right,
family when they need the help, right?
right,
And but the chain of command and engineering is supporting you to get this, but it's the XO who don't really know what's going on the deck plates. He
right,
just being an administrator.
right. So so that went through, and they went back and told the XO, and the XO finally at that point, we was a month from deployment now. He
Right.
said, "Well, the only way he can stay behind if he can find another person on another ship that want to swap with him." I was like, "What?"
In a month, that ain't gonna happen.
I said, "Wait a minute now. I've done everything you've asked up to this point to
Right.
try to get help, and everything has failed through because people just can't do it."
Yeah.
So at that point, I told the chief and the DCA I want to go talk to the captain. So we set up a meeting, and we were all in there with the captain. The XO was in there, and the captain said, "Okay, tell me what's going on." So I laid it all out for him. He told him, "Hey, I did everything the XO asked, and a month from deployment, now he's telling me that I need to find somebody to do a swap with." I said, "Look, I'm not trying to go to shore duty or be on shore. You can send me to another ship, for 6 months until you come back off deployment." And he was like, "You know what?" He said, "I guess he graduated CO school with the CO that was on the Ogden."
Mm.
So he made arrangements, and I actually went to the Ogden for 6 months while the Anchorage was on deployment, and that's where I made chief
Okay.
on the mighty Ogden.
Oh, we made chief on the same ship. I made chief on the Augie Dog too. I decommissioned the Ogden. You know what? I appreciate that CO, right? Because here's what I would tell you, man. As when I was a CMC, bro, you don't know how many sailors I took care of, dog. Like for
Yeah,
real. My COs were so dope. I would go and be like, "Sir, this first class petty officer having a baby. We gonna be underway. I'm gonna get them to this ship to be TDY. So until the baby's born, and they'll fly. They're gonna pay for their own ticket to meet us at this location." And the CO is always like, "All right, Master, you got it." Because me and the mess would always figure out a way to cover for them, and the
yeah,
COs would say yes. And that XO, I mean, I appreciate the XO trying to be a hardliner, whatever it is. But when
yeah,
it's a family situation like that, just
yeah,
get to the right answer, bro. Get to the right
yeah,
answer and take care of the family because it ain't even about you, Brian. It's about your wife.
yeah, Yeah.
right? And I always had that lens. And whenever a Navy family was in need, me, I always was like, look, the shop will always figure it out,
Figure it out.
right?
Yeah.
Especially you at DC1, been on there 4.5 years. Ain't
Yeah.
like you're running around doing sound security watches anymore. You know what I'm saying?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
You really just an administrator too, right?
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
admin guy. So I'm glad that CO took care of you, got you to
Yeah.
go to the Ogden. How was that making chief petty officer on a ship where you didn't really know anybody?
Man, yeah, that was that. I knew one guy on there.
Okay.
Uh, because me and him had, we had ran into each other before, and he was a DC1, uh, Ellis. So I knew him, but there was a first class on there that, I mean, this guy was, because I made chief. He had already been in like 19 years.
Oh.
Yeah, he, yeah. He didn't like the fact that you got this young chief here.
Yeah.
Yeah, that only ain't been in 12 years, and you telling me what to do.
You
Yeah.
know what kills me about that, bro? When people take it personal, like you just took their opportunity, brother.
Yeah.
You made chief off of the Anchorage,
Yeah.
right? Had nothing to do with no
Dude.
Ogden, right?
Right. Yeah.
When I went to GW and I made senior chief, bro, you should have seen those salty dudes, bro. They were so angry at me because I only been on board the ship like 2 months and I messed around to make senior chief. And all these
Oh.
chiefs, none of them make senior chief. They were so mad. I'm like, y'all were with y'all don't know my life. You don't know how I
Exactly.
got here. Be
Yeah.
happy for people, bro. Just
Yeah.
be happy.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
on the Ogden, let me back up one thing. So when the Anchorage came back from deployment, I went back to Anchorage, and I think I had about 4 months left
Right.
before I transferred out. And they wrote up a in the tour award. The XO turned that down.
XO of the Anchorage,
Yeah.
just still
When I
salty.
when I got back to the Anchorage, the chief and the DCA wrote up me an in the tour award, and he was like, "Well, he missed the deployment, and he made chief. That ought to be good enough." I was like, "Wow." I said, "Really? That's it, huh?"
But again, the CO should have been involved in that conversation
Yeah.
too,
Yeah.
because I would again as a master chief, bro. I would have straight just laughed at that XO's face, but you ain't the one, dog. You ain't the
Yeah.
one. And,
Yeah.
and I've been very blessed to have. I've had more good XOs than good COs. I'll be honest with you, homie. Like
Yeah.
I had some tough COs, dude. That it was
Mm.
like, they were real. It was not fun.
Yeah.
My XOs was always with me trying to figure it out because the CO was, if we could not take it to him, it was probably the better thing because if we took it to him, it was going to be a problem, right?
Right.
Uh, but if I had an XO doing something like that to a
Yeah.
chief, bro, you ain't going to know. This is a 5-year total thing. This ain't
Totally.
about the last 6 months,
Yeah. Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Right? And there you go. So
But yeah, so we got with the Ogden, and I, Master Chief Madigan he was the HTCM. He ran our division over there,
right,
and they wrote up an award for me.
and an
Uh,
impact award for that 6 months.
yeah. Yeah. So
See, that's how easy it can be, though, right?
yeah.
It's literally that easy, bro. Like
Yeah.
but it's not about the Navy as a whole. It's just about people sometimes in positions that are
Right.
just kind of being turkeys, right? And
Hmm.
then, yeah, no, I
Yeah.
get that. How was initiation for you? Did you enjoy that initiation process?
Let me tell you, woo, yeah, it was all not like it is today.
Okay,
Mind you, yeah, we went through hell over there. Yeah, I mean,
well,
it was we were right out in the parking lot, and it's always a lesson to be learned
Right.
when you're going through this stuff. Uh, and I don't know where they got this big pole from. It was as thick as a telephone pole, you know. And it was only five of us that,
Okay.
on the ship that made chief. And they had us running around, right? We was like around at Pier 12 down there, running around the parking lot with that, that thing on our shoulder. They was like, keep running. Just think, this is the weight of the ship on your shoulders. As the chief. You gotta keep going, keep pushing.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, it was. I mean, some stuff we thought, okay, what's the meaning behind this?
Right.
Other stuff it kind of sunk in. But yeah, it was no holds barred during that time. I
What
mean,
year did you make chief?
98.
1998. Okay. Um, so you're going through initiation. Were you excited about that initiation process, or did you even know that much about it at that point?
Didn't know. No, the only initiation I knew much about was crossing the equator.
Right.
you know, doing that whole little ceremony thing. Hadn't seen too many, chief initiations and what they went through because, everything is done outside of everybody else's sight.
Right.
So yeah, it was, don't know what to expect, but I mean, here I am at this point. So we're going to do the best we can do.
Okay.
Yeah.
Was it when it was over, right, and you were done? Did you think it got the job done? Did it looking back on it, were you better for having gone through that, or was it really not a factor?
No, I think the lessons that we learned, kind of helped us. Well, I can speak for myself.
Right.
Help me moving forward to look at the bigger picture of what's going on with the command and why we do certain things, and why certain things has to be done, and we got to get on board with it. So yeah,
Right.
in that sense, yeah.
Yeah, it breaks down a lot of boundaries, breaks down a lot
Yeah.
of stereotypes for people. And I'll tell you, for me, going through initiation, I was always able to walk into any room with chiefs in it and feel comfortable,
Yeah.
right? Where I would always get frustrated was I could tell the people that were like counterfeit, right? Those are the ones I didn't like.
Right.
But then I was always, as a young go getter, I was always more than happy to call them out, right? Let's go ahead and have that conversation because
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
learned that in my initiation, right? We're gonna throw
Right.
it out. We
Yeah.
gonna have that tough talk. So where did you go after that whole Anchorage Ogden journey? What was your next shortity?
I went to Fleet Training Center,
So was
and
it were you instructing?
I taught the C school for
Which one?
DC.
So DKs.
Yeah, I right across from the fire school.
Okay, you went there.
Yeah.
So I did that job when I was in Norfolk. I taught
Yeah.
DCA senior enlisted school. At that time, was that just senior enlisted or was it senior enlisted and DCAs?
No, it was just senior listed.
Okay,
But
yeah,
let me
because
tell you, here's the irony of that.
right.
I still didn't have any NECs. I didn't have the 4811 or the 4805.
Hey, God did. Right. Hey, bro, that's why you was the right guy from help to help me. Because you understood how it could happen to somebody.
Yeah,
Right?
so yeah, and when I got to Fleet Training Center, yeah, they's like, hey, you're gonna be over here. You're gonna be teaching the senior listed DC school. I'm like, oh, okay. Um, and I remember Dan Marsh. He was the chief over there, and then we had a female senior chief that was there, and he gave me his take on uh, once I went through the instructor school and got that certification, and now I'm about to go start teaching. And he was like, "Hey, man, how long you been in?" I was like, 12. He said, "All right, when you get up to do your intro, do not say you've been in 12 years. Just skip that part. He said, because you're going to have some people in the class,
Right.
that is going to probably grumble and say, what is this guy, this junior chief, going to teach me that I don't
Right.
already know? Yeah. He said, whether it be another chief or a first class that's got more years in, he said, so just skip that intro. Don't
Yeah.
put that in your intro. I was like, all right, yeah, not a problem. Yeah.
Right.
But that tour was it was pretty rewarding tour. That's where I got my master training specialist there. At the school at that place. I was well, back then, I don't know what they call it now. I was the C squared M squared
Yep.
for the watertight door course that was in the other building. Plus teaching that class and um, yeah, other duties as far as once the students come in and getting all their records over to PSD, making sure the travel is straight, making
Yep.
sure they're getting paid. I had a chief that came there and had made senior chief, uh, but hadn't put it on because the last command didn't get the paperwork done. So, making sure all that got done so that guy could go ahead and get promoted while he was there at the class. But um, I mean, I had a blast over at the schoolhouse. So
Were you a part of the Naval Base San Diego Chiefs mess, or was y'all your own Chiefs mess?
yeah, we kind of had our own little group thing going on over there.
Okay.
Yeah, we wasn't part of the bigger command.
Was FTC like a whole engineering thing, or was it just the damage controlment?
No, you had an engineering. Damage control. We had the fire school and the C school.
Yeah.
And then the engineers had their own building where they had their schools and stuff.
But yeah, they used to call it the glass tower or something like that, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah,
because when I was in SWAS, because they eventually they take FTC and they put it under Surface Warfare Officer School,
right,
and that's
right.
where they combine the officers and the senior enlisted, and then all of us was under SWAS. So I was the leading guy for DK's Norfolk, and then you had like Danny Burke was over at the fire school, and you had some other guys that was at engineering. We was all in the same Chiefs mess
Cheap. Mm-hmm.
just for numbers, right? For numbers
Right.
and because for initiation and stuff like that, because otherwise you wouldn't have. Now, did you have a lot of DC-1 instructors and DC chiefs? Because over there, civilian instructors already at the fire school.
No, not when I was there.
Okay.
It was all military. So we had a lot of chiefs. We had a lot of first classes. We had the Airedales there because they was doing like the
Yep.
flight deck stuff.
Yep.
So yeah, we really didn't have civilians. I know they got them now, but
Yeah.
yeah, back when I was over there, no, we didn't have that.
Yeah. When I got to Norfolk and I saw Farrier Fire School, they were almost 100% military, no
Yeah,
civilian. Whereas Naval Base San Diego is almost 100% civilian.
really. Yeah,
Like not that many million, and it's a significant difference, in my
yeah.
opinion, just
Hmm.
just the training style. But it's a lot of retired dudes that are doing the job. It ain't like
Oh
they're
yeah,
not former Navy, right?
yeah,
They just want to have somebody that moves or whatever it is. But like I can imagine, like now when the government shut down, they probably not teaching much classes right now because none of them dudes coming to work.
yeah,
If they're GSs, they might just be contractors though too.
yeah.
Um,
Now, one thing at uh being at the schoolhouse, you got the SHs, you got a lot of schools there. So
yeah,
there's a lot of competition as far as chiefs going up against other chiefs for recognition, and you getting your evaluations, and yeah, that was rough.
I
I
bet
mean, we had to fight for recognition because some of us were CDOs. Uh,
for the base.
yeah, for the schoolhouse. So hey,
Oh,
we
for
acted
sure.
on we acted on behalf of the CO while he ain't while he's not here, after
Right.
hours. So, and in a sense, you've already separated us from the other chiefs because we're qualified to do this job. So, you know, you got to give us some higher marks and rankings here.
Right.
Uh, yeah. So that was a tough part that we had to kind of fight for there, kind of towards the end. Yeah, but
I bet. I mean, I was fortunate that when I did SWAS, it was all engineering, but even then, it was like being on the ship and you had to manage, and we all had different UX, right? There was
yeah,
all different UX. And so that could become a challenge too, because you have one CO with like 4 different UX.
yeah,
And people didn't really know each other, but they was all doing really good on their own. How do you
mhm,
how do you rank them against each other when they're doing such different things? So you had to find commonalities. And then, of course, the recommendations from the Chiefs master
chief,
always made a lot too,
right,
as far as what was going on. And I'll tell you what, the SHs ain't nothing to play with,
right.
right? Like you got to be sharp to be an SH chief. Like they are no joke. They, 'cause that rate is like it's like RP. Like it's a small rate.
Yeah.
So here you are at the end of your time at the Fleet Training Center. Here you've been training up senior enlisted people for the last 2-3 years. Are you excited to go back to the fleet and go? Like you got to go to Fort Leonard Wood. You got to go back to the school you just been teaching, right?
Yeah, actually, so before I even transferred out, about probably about my last year, they actually sent me to Fort Leonard Wood, and
Okay.
I got that NEC. And since I'd already been teaching the class,
Yeah,
yeah, hey, I got the certificate for that too. So
that just makes sense. Yeah.
yeah,
So coming out of that tour, here you are now about 15 years in the Navy. What's the year frame? Is it 9/11 yet or no?
9/11 happened while I was there. Yeah,
Okay. What was that like? What were you thinking about when that happened? Right? Because you're going to go back to sea. You're watching
yeah,
these towers drop.
yeah.
What was crossing your mind then?
Man, we were actually in session with a class, and we had a class, and they sent everybody home,
Right.
and they's like, hey, don't come back until we call you. So we were sitting at home watching TV, and yeah, it was like, man, I'm about to go back out to sea,
Yeah.
and you know, I'd already had orders, so I know I was going to a frigate, uh, the Rents, and I was like, okay, so we're gonna be with a battle group out there, and hey, I need to go ahead and get all my business in order,
Yeah.
you know.
Well, when you were on your first ships, did any of them ever go to Persian Gulf or do like Desert Storm or Iraq War or anything like that?
So the Germantown, when I was leaving the Germantown, they were actually getting ready to go over there.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, I missed that because they were actually headed off. I was at North Island during that time.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then Anchorage, nothing
And
like.
then Anchorage, nothing there on the Anchorage. Yeah.
Okay. So you're going to the Rents, which is, oh, by the way, much different than your first few ships, right? Right? Like, let's be honest, bro. The amphibs got people, carriers got people, frigates ain't got no damn people, bro.
People, yeah. Yeah. And going to the Rents, we pretty much only did counter narcotic ops, up around Panama and Ecuador.
Okay.
But with that, we had to take a Coast Guard detachment with us because they're only ones allowed to board a ship in those waters.
Right.
So that brings another problem because we got to leave some crew behind to accommodate the Coast Guard.
For the racks.
Yeah. So you always got people trying to figure out how or a good reason why they need to stay behind. You know.
What was it like reporting to the Rents And now you're kind of a seasoned chief, right? You've been a chief
Yeah,
now for 3 years, but this is your first ship as a chief, like walking
first
on
ship.
board.
Yeah.
How was that? How was that going into that chief's mess and going into our division at that time?
You know what? The first I went there early because a guy I was stationed with on the Germantown, he's a SH. He was on the rents. Uh, he was a MA1. He converted to MA. And I went there one day just to look around on the ship, and I went in the chief's mess and I ran into the CMC. And um, I told him, hey, I'm gonna be checking on board here in a few weeks, and I just came by to check out the ship and look up an old shipmate, that was on here. And first thing he said, well, yeah, he a first class, so I don't expect you to be hanging around him. I was like, okay, yeah, all right. And
Yeah.
then he went to tell me, he was like, yeah, he said, I'll tell you right now that we got some what word did he use? He was identifying some chiefs. I guess he was trying to say they was rogue chiefs, so they were bad for the mess. And he
Mhm.
said, I hope that when you get here, you don't hang out with them, but you hang out with me and this group of chiefs. So that let me know right now, y'all, you separated
Yeah.
as a mess. So I'm like, okay. So, when I finally reported on board there, I think I was there 2 days, and we were underway, and we headed to Seal Beach. We was going up to pick up some ammo and stuff. And
Right.
yeah, on the way up there, um, as soon as I checked on board, the other chief, he was pretty much walking out the door.
I had it.
And
You got it, bro.
yeah, yeah. And yeah, on the way up there, they was like, hey, we're gonna do a countermeasure washdown check. And I'm like, okay. So I started going through the DC book and walking around and kind of looking at stuff, and I was like, we can't do a countermeasure washdown test because all this Circle Williams stuff is not correct. Because I went back to the DC book and looked at it. I said, this book is incomplete. The RPM is incomplete because you're missing some fittings. We can't do this check. You might have water coming in the ventilation systems and stuff. And went on up and told the CO that, and yeah, here I am working throughout the night trying to fix this problem,
Right.
so that we could get that countermeasure washdown test done on the way back. Yeah, and I had some good people on there. I had this one MR guy that he wasn't good at all. He was first
No.
class. Uh, but still he was partly in the DC in our shop, but we only had one small shop on the frigate anyway. So we all dealt with DC and CHT stuff.
Yeah,
Uh,
well, it was pretty common to have back in those days. I would say senior MR1s that were salty, right? Because they
yeah,
making chief in that rate is almost
yeah,
impossible unless you want a carrier or a tender or something like that, right? You're not gonna get that respect in the general workshop. And
right.
then what was that like for the DCA when you were like, sir, this watch this RPM, like we got you're gonna flood the damn ventilation system out and give us more problems in the future. How did they receive that news from the new chief on board?
Oh man, what's funny is the DCA was fresh out of the academy, ensign.
So it was a straight stick, like swole.
Yeah,
Oh, he
yeah,
was thinking, okay, he
yeah.
he needs a chief. Okay.
And the chief engineer, I mean, he had been there. He's a guy from Louisiana. Had red hair. Uh, he was pretty receptive, and and he was like, okay. He said, well, chief, he said, we got to do we got to do to get it going. I was
Yeah.
like, yeah, I'm already working on it. So Yeah, the DCA was yeah, so he was depending on me
Okay.
because he just got there. Yeah.
You know what's funny about that, bro, is you know how many times that's similar things that happen to other people? Like the Navy's not new. The
Right.
ship's not new, right? People be doing. I got to the aircraft carrier, and we did not even have legitimate diagrams of our HLF system, the whole system, to do in-serve checks appropriately, right? So
Mm.
like we had to literally draw the HLF system and diagrams, and I'm just like, how come we have to do this? Why is there not already
Already.
drawn
Right.
for the ship? But there just wasn't, right?
Yeah.
There just wasn't. And I'm just, how was the DC man doing it before I got here? Right. And but people, for the most part, people don't ask those questions, right?
Right.
They just thumbs up, DC1 is good, right? You guys did it. Good job.
Yeah.
Okay. How come we got flooding? We'll have to figure that out later, sir. But kind of might as well watch down, check us up, right? We good.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
I was doing the DC role probably for about a year and a half, right?
Mhm.
And then we got a HTC, and the CO says, hey, we got two chiefs in our division. They had a HTC that was a 3M coordinator. He was underperforming. So the CO was like, we're gonna send DCC to 3M school. He gonna be our new 3M coordinator.
Right.
So I went to the 3M school, came back to the ship, because they had already fired the HTC and got him off of there.
Yeah.
And so I'm getting back there, looking at programs, and I'm like, damn. I said, he ain't got nothing that he's supposed to have. I had to start
Right.
from scratch, building the whole program. And that CO transferred. Yeah. We got a new CO that came in, and he says, first time he sees me, he said, I hear you're the 3MC, right? I was like, yes, sir. He said, oh, that's just a alternate duty. I was like, not really. That's my primary duty. And he was like, okay, we'll have to talk about that. Now the guy that got slotted to come there as a 3MC was an MMC.
Right.
But when he got there, the ENC was too weak of a chief and he wasn't getting the job done. So they put him as the A division chief.
Right.
Uh yeah, man. So we went through a 3M inspection and they came over to do an assist visit. And out of the assist, they upgraded it to a 3M inspection and we got certified.
Right.
So not shortly after that, insert was coming around. And
Right.
the CO was like, all right, chief, I need you to take off the 3M hat and put on the insert hat. I'm like, okay, well, we got an HTC, but yeah, okay, not a problem.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So we went through InServe, got through that, uh, came out of that, looking good. And yeah, the XO at the time, when he got there, um, he noticed some disparities with what with the way the CMC did his rankings, and who was actually doing real work.
Right.
So he got some stuff fixed on that end, and I made senior chief coming off the rinse.
So just so I understand, so the CMC wasn't really respecting the work you was doing for the ship, it sounds like, but the XO was.
Yeah, I mean, what is a ET chief? What is he
Right.
doing more than what a damage control chief is doing?
Right.
As
Well,
far as
especially
these
when you
inspections.
managing like the 3M program and the InServe program, all this stuff. And here's the thing, right? What these seamen are typically get pulled into 3M because everyone's afraid of ER09, right?
Yeah,
And we
Oh yeah.
know ER9 because it's our community, right? So we
Yeah.
understand it. But the problem is there's one thing to run the program, it's another thing to run the shop,
Right.
right? And DC can run the program, but I've had to run the program and the shop, and that's
Well,
hard,
it
right?
is.
That's a conundrum, especially when they're not giving you good support with good
Poor. Yeah.
people. So
Right.
I can see. Were you in the HTC that was running our division? Were y'all good? Like, were y'all able to work well with each other, or was there friction there?
No, we were good.
Okay.
And unfortunately, that CO that we had during that time, he was a yeller,
Oh,
and I didn't necessarily agree with his tactics, but I mean, he would yell at a chief in a hallway. He
right.
didn't care who was around. That's just the way he was. And the CMC, he wasn't. We had a new CMC now, and he wasn't down with that. Because he yelled at the CMC a few times, and they kind of got into it.
Well, that ain't gonna work.
Yeah,
I had that once or twice too. We had to go behind closed doors and have that conversation, right? Because
yeah,
there you go. Um, who was running the damage control training team? Was that you still as the DCC, or was that the
yes.
HTC in our
I
division?
was still running the training team at that time. Yeah,
So I mean, all I hear, and I'll tell you what, as a CMC, I did the exact same thing, bro. I had underperforming 3MC. I got my mess together, and I was like, look, we got this program as a Chiefs program. We cannot fail, but we need someone that can do it because y'all got to run your jobs. You can't afford for the program to not be healthy, even though
right,
your people are doing their jobs,
right,
right? And we made those shifts, right? I remember I got a chief that came to the ship, and he was supposed to be a 3MC, and I already had somebody else doing the 3MC job. I was like, well, bro, you might have thought you was gonna be the 3MC, but you about to be in the E division because you an electrician, dog, and
yeah,
electricians need help. And I don't need 3MC, I need an EMC. Batter up.
right,
But that's the way you gotta be on a ship, bro. On a
right,
surface ship, you got to you got to play the hand that you're dealt. You can't
right,
just focus on what your billet was. What does
right.
the ship need from you?
Yeah,
And then for the insert thing, same thing, right? I had to go to a chief petty officer that I knew was a shaker and a mover and put him in charge of insert, but I was able to put one for engineering and one for topside, right?
right,
And then then work together to help them coordinate with the
right,
officer to put it all together. And that's what successful ships do. And it
right.
just sounded
Exactly.
like you was that force multiplier, right?
Yeah,
Because we'll put Chief Nelson in there, and you made everyone else do better, right? Made
yeah,
everyone else do better. And then I'm thankful to hear that you had an XO come in and recognize, because unfortunately, that's how it can be sometimes. Because sometimes I've seen some CMCs in my career that would be threatened by a guy like that, right? Because here you are managing these command level programs. They're directly reporting to the XO,
so right,
right? You direct XO 3M,
yeah,
XO Inserve,
yeah,
XO DSET, right? Like
right,
none the CMCs and none of those conversations.
right,
So they could be a little bit a person who's insecure could be uncomfortable with that, right?
right,
And
right,
they might value a chief that's always coming to see them about, heads and beds or working parties or whatever that is, right? But
right,
I'm glad the XO waited. Just goes to show you, remember you had that old XO on Anchorage that was
yeah,
playing games with you,
right,
right? Then you got this other XO in the future that helped you out and took care of you,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
That's
yeah.
awesome, man.
He was like, man. He said, Chief. He said, I tell you what. He said, I'm 3M manager. That that's my program.
Yep,
And
100%.
if we
100%.
fail, that could be a mark against me. Yeah. So
Well, and that's what I used to, when I, again, as a CMC, the Chiefs sent out, they would cutting about their rankings, whatever it was. And I would say, look, bro, I can speak to all this, but ultimately, is your boss really, really happy with your job? Because
right.
ultimately, there's a chain of command, and I'm not in that chain of command, right?
Yeah.
You work for an officer, they've got a role. I could talk to the captain. It's the captain's rankings. But if your boss don't like what the job is you're doing for him, you better have a real good reason. You better be able to
Yep.
explain to me. I'll advocate for you. But if it's because he feels like you're more worried about collateral duties than your primary job for him, it's a thing.
Yeah.
And when that CO told you, well, I see 3M as being a secondary job, and then he said, I
Right.
need you to do in-serve, you batter up. You smoke that
Yep.
too,
Yep.
right? All right, sir. And that was a smart move on his part because in-serve and 3M go together, right?
Right.
For
Yeah.
sure. So when you're leaving the rents, is that when you go to ATG?
That's when I go to ATG.
So when you go to ATG, were you already a senior chief, or did you make senior chief on the way there?
No, I made senior chief on the rents.
So at the end of your tour on the rents.
Yeah. So when I got there, though, they thought I was a chief.
Well, because you were frocked, right? Not paid yet.
Yeah. So they was like, when I got there, I met Joaquin, HMCM, and he's
Yeah,
like,
rest
"Oh,
in
you're
peace, man. Rest in peace,
yeah,
Jake, bro.
yeah." He said, "Oh, you a senior chief?" I was like, "Yeah." He's like, "Okay." But yeah, getting there, man, they had a chief that was running stuff for the DC side.
Mm-hmm.
And Jake kind of gave me a brief on what was going on with the DC men, and things just wasn't uh, going right with them as
Yeah,
far as leadership was going. So I sat there for a while, and almost, I think when I got there, it was almost evaluation time. I think I probably maybe 6 months into me being there, and I'm already seeing who's doing what, right? So we sat down, me, Jake, and the other engineers, and we was doing rankings and stuff. You know what I'm saying? And when I showed him, hey, this is how I want to rank the DC man, he said, "You sure about that?" I said, "Yeah, what's wrong?" He said, "Well, that's not how it was before." I said, "Well, I'm not sure how it was before." I said, "But in all fairness, this is the way it should be now, from what
right,
I've seen." Yeah. But the chief that was there was, he was hooking up the people that really wasn't doing the work.
right.
Uh, yeah. So me and him kind of bumped heads a little bit there, uh, all the way up until the time he left.
I bet.
Uh, yeah. So he, he think he had a drinking problem. Well, I know he had a drinking problem because sometimes he would show up there and you would just smell it on him.
Yeah,
Um, and me and him and Captain Diefenbach, we had some discussions about his performance and about his ability to be to work when he's supposed to, and he used to make a lot of excuses why he couldn't come to work.
right.
Yeah, so
Yeah. The thing about ATG, at least for me, when I got there, there was a lot of sour chiefs, bro. Like in our DC shop. And
mhm.
I remember when I first got there, I'm a young chief coming off the ship, just got the opportunity to come to the DC shop. I'm
Yeah.
excited because I get to go ride all these ships and learn how to be a better DC chief, right? Like
Hmm.
I'm and secretly I already know I want to become a CMC at that point, right? Like
Hmm.
I during initiation, I bought into like, okay, I'm gonna make Master Chief and become a command Master Chief because I love this chief stuff, right?
Yeah.
Like I bought into it, but so that for me, I was gonna learn. And then all these dudes were just so grumpy and pissy and angry and all this stuff. And then welcome to the boneyard. DC men don't get no respect here, blah, blah, blah. And I remember you told me, you were like, Gary, don't listen to them guys, bro. They don't know what they're talking about. And then you said Greg Green is the number one chief of this command right now. And you put me on Greg's team, as a matter of fact, right?
Hmm.
And me and Greg would talk about it. I gotta get Greg on here too, bro. Like I gotta get Greg on here. And Greg, he taught me everything. And he said, all right, Gary, just do all the things that I did. You're gonna be good. And But the other thing was you turned the DC shop into being competitive because that's like one of the biggest Chiefs messes in San Diego,
Right.
right? ATG is like, Eli Robles is the command master chief there right now.
Oh,
And
really?
he is. And he was my DC one at ATG San Diego,
Okay.
right?
Yeah, I remember him.
Bro, he's on his third tour at ATG right now. He made chief there. He went back as a senior chief, and now he's the command master chief for a float training group San Diego, right?
Mm.
But I will tell you, my generation of ATG, not really my first year, but that second year, because you're like Ben Andrews, he made Master Chief. He's
Hmm.
currently with Hasso, who's running damage control for Surface Forces Pacific,
Yeah.
right? And Juice came through there, but you got all that going, right? You provided the opportunity for the DC men to get the respect because not only do we got to compete with the engineers
Yeah.
who are working with all the officers on all the engineering teams, and we
Hmm.
was always the extra people, right? But then also all the topsiders who are downstairs, right? And
Right.
Dan Field, he's currently the 7th Fleet CMC.
Right.
He's
Right.
he about to
About to
retire.
retire. Yeah.
Yeah. Fred Chavez, he was a CMC.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what happened with Palacios and some of them other guys, but I know that those two for sure made Mass Chief. And then I had Danielle Wiley on the podcast not too long ago. She
Yeah.
retired
Yeah.
as a warrant officer,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
Yeah. I've been in her career since she was like a third class.
Over. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's awesome, man. Bro,
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
was when you look back at your ATG time, because you chose to retire after ATG, right?
Yeah.
What was the biggest takeaways you had from your float training group time? Because I'll tell you what, man, you was a leader at ATG. Everybody respected you.
Yeah.
Um,
Because when I got there, and like I said, from the beginning, once, I said, hey, I want to make chief and I want to make change, and I want to take care of people. When I got to ATG, it seemed like nobody there, none of the DC men was getting any recognition. There was no state of the quarters. There was none of that. No type of awards. And
right,
I stepped in there and I got the first classes of recognition they needed, and also the chiefs, the people that was performing, because some of them was you know they were troubled and they
right.
had been in trouble. uh, yeah, and so yeah, that was my biggest motivation, is to make sure that I took care of people that the people that want to succeed and move on. You can
Yeah.
tell, and those is just gonna do the bare minimum, to get by.
Well, and
Uh,
look, and you go on that ship and you a bare minimum guy and you
yeah,
talking the wrong stuff, you go get your butt kicked. Like they gonna get you,
yeah,
right? Because I mean,
yeah,
I seen it a few times and I learned real quick it wasn't gonna be me, right?
yeah,
Especially you go on an aircraft carrier where you got a DC master chief you going up against, or a senior chief,
right,
or an LDO warrant officer who's been a damage control expert for a long time. They gonna be they'll call back to the ATG building and say, "What's up with this clown?" Right?
yeah,
Like, what's he doing? And there you go. And so we had to worry about not just respect on the waterfront,
right.
but also respect within our own community at ATG and getting that recognition.
Listen, yeah.
And with
Now,
the engineers.
yeah, and I'd already, I'd had, I knew Greg was leaving, so somebody had to replace it.
Yeah.
Uh, None of the other people wanted to do the carriers.
I,
Political, uh,
yeah.
but hey, you was a go getter, so I was like, hey, Gary, go ahead, man. You can do great things here, and this will put you at the next level.
Yep.
Yeah,
And that was
yeah,
it. Hey, and that's all I wanted to hear. Roger
yeah,
that. Battle up. You said you're gonna be on the way a lot. I said I'm
yeah,
okay with that.
yeah,
Because again, I'm thankful just to be in the shop, right? Like I was just thankful to be in the shop And people don't
Yeah.
know this about me, but when I was at ATG, I sat down with every CMC on every ship I ever went to get
Okay.
CMC training. Every
Oh,
ship, I had the PQS book out, and every ship I'd go get with that CMC and be like, "Hey, bro, or sis, I appreciate a few moments. Get some of these line items signed off, whatever it was." So for me on that carrier, bro, I had Air Wing CMCs, I had the ship CMC. There were so many people I could get a hold of and talk to, and
right.
then I knew that I had to go to an aircraft carrier next to be a contender for those next levels. And coming
Right.
from an airfib, I never even had SCBAs yet, bro. I came
Right.
from OBAs to ATG.
TG. Yeah.
Yeah. So I learned SCBAs at ATG,
TG.
walk in DC and do checks,
Yeah.
right? I go from doing that to my own aircraft carrier. And you remember there was a guy named Miller at ATG Norfolk. He was supposed to be going to the George Washington with me. He called me up. He's like, "Gary, I'm going to GW with you. It's going to be good." Bro, he didn't go. He canceled his overseas screening. He retired, dropped papers. So I was the only chief on the ship. And thank God I had that aircraft carrier experience
Yeah.
to survive, you know?
Yeah.
But and then Eli Robles relieved me as the carrier guy when I left ATG, and now look at
Okay.
where he's at, right? Like
Yeah.
that was the job, but not everybody wanted to do it because it was different. You had to deal with
Right.
aviation, air forces, right? It wasn't
Right.
Surf Corps, and they're a
Right.
little different. You had to deal with the
Right.
nukes, and you had to deal with the aviation guys, right?
Right. Right.
So what was it that when you decided to retire? Why did you decide? You know what? Hey, I'm gonna go ahead because I remember for me it was pivotal when you chose to retire. I really paid attention to that, right? Like I was at your retirement ceremony, and I remember you walked away. It was like 24 years in the Navy. I feel like 24, 25 years, and you said I'm choosing my like. For me, I remember you said you were choosing your family
Yeah.
over. Was that what it was? Do I remember that
Yeah.
correctly?
Yeah. Actually, I only did 22 and 10 months. Um, but yeah, I thought about it and, I was like, okay, I'm going back out to sea, still got the issues with the medical and I just didn't want to, coming off a good shore duty tour, um, being there, all the time for anything that might have came up, and I just decided I'm not going back out to sea and
Okay.
have to deal with with that and not being able to get back when I need to. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Um, how was that transition for you coming out of the Navy? Because you retired at what was it, 20
2009,
09? Yeah,
09,
09.
yeah, yeah. I left retired in '09 and I started working for the federal government December that year, same year.
Right there in San Diego?
No, in Texas.
Okay, so you chose
Yeah.
to relocate right away to Texas.
Well, my family had already been here. I bought a house here, had a house built 2 years before I retired, so that they would already be established here.
Mhm.
And I was geo bacheloring for 2 years. So I was staying over at the sub base
Okay,
in the Geo Bachelor barracks.
right.
So yeah, so I already had the house here, and then was just waiting to retire and come home. Yep.
Okay. And so you get back to Texas, and you chose Texas just because that's where you're originally from, or was it because like I chose
It,
Florida, but I'm not gonna lie to you, no state taxes, and they good to the military, right? They good to veterans.
yeah. Well, so for me, it was more of a medical. Uh, for our son, it was either stay in San Diego, go to Norfolk, or come to Texas. So I chose the cheaper of the three.
Okay.
Uh, um, so that's why we moved on down here to San Antonio. because we had called around to the different hospitals, and we found the people here that's you know the CF doctors, and the hospital was right close. So yeah, that
Okay.
was why we got down here.
When you first left the Navy, because I'll be honest, I'm kind of going through something right now where I've been retired now, coming up on 4 years, and I'm starting to feel like I'm supposed to be moving somewhere. I'm starting to feel like, bro, like my job at the school, they're doing so good that I'm like, as a CMC, almost every 2 years, you almost want to transfer because your job is done in like 2 years,
Right.
right? And you almost feel like you're meddling with people if you stick around because everyone's doing what you told them to do. And now it's like
Right.
they don't need you to do so much. And that's how it is in my high school. And I'm like, I'm realizing like I'm not moving nowhere, bro. Like this is where I'm
This is
staying here
it.
for a long time.
Yeah.
Like, did you
Yeah.
go through that?
Yeah. Yeah. It's like, man, I miss it.
Yeah.
Because I'm not gonna lie to you, coming from the military, going to be a civil service employee, oh, buddy, I had some issues at
It's not.
first. Oh yeah, because I work with the Air Force security forces people, and let me tell you, the military. Well, at first I was working with Army, and then it switched over to Air Force, and the standards that I was seeing, I was like, "Whoa, what's going on here?"
Yeah.
I'm like, I'm not used to this. Not that I'm a civilian, but I'm seeing these military people walking around with, um, makeup, eyelashes, uh, hair. I was like, this is ridiculous.
Yeah.
Yeah, it took me a while to get used to. No, I wouldn't even say get used to it, but just to see this, and then you got people that's not correcting them.
I would tell you, Brian, that is I would from 2010, 11 until now is when it really got out of the box, bro. It wasn't until recently that people that was leaders are finally feeling comfortable to start correcting stuff again. Because
Yeah,
there was a long stretch where it just felt like if you said anything, it was going to get flipped back on you, like you was being wrong or you was being
wrong.
prejudiced
Yeah,
or
yeah,
whatever it was. And a lot of my peers, part of this is why I chose to retire when I did, right? Because I was just tired of being around people that were afraid to lead by
right.
the book. And then because everyone was catching cases. People were catching
Mm,
cases left and right, but then you see these people being so unprofessional or out of standards, and you
right.
ask yourself, like, "But what are we doing? Like, why
Mm,
why are we here?" And I can only imagine it would make you uncomfortable, right? I can only imagine, or disappointed even, right? Like,
right.
yeah, I can see that. So, how long did you do that until you decided to leave that job?
No, I'm still. I've been in the civil service for. It'll be 17 years in December.
Okay, so you just managed to make it work. You just managed to
Yep.
let it go. And
Yep.
that's the other thing, right? A lot of military, from what I can see, because I can talk about I try not to talk too much about what's going on in the current day Navy
Right.
because I've been retired now 3-4 years. So I don't want to talk about new policies or whatever it is, but I can talk about my experience,
Yeah. Right.
right? I can talk about my experience. But when I got to my duty station with these where I'm at now with these kids, they were being really hard on them when it comes to like hair standards or whatever it was. And I was like, look, I'm not gonna be tougher on these students than we are on actual sailors in the real Navy today. Like that's
Right.
not gonna happen. These are
Right.
kids,
Right.
right? And you have to just learn to find a way to be the to be in a space that can be fair and to get along with people, but
Yeah.
and to relax. So what do you do for the civil service then? Are you still involved with security forces?
Yeah. I still work for the security forces. Yeah, I'm a security assistant. So um, I got 3 more years. I hit 20, and I'm punching out.
Okay. Well, good for
Yeah,
you, bro.
and unfortunately, with this furlough, they're not paying us. But you know, uh, the other part to that is, I got other sources of income coming in, so not affecting me as much as it's affecting, some of those other folks that hey, this is their only income, because it's
That
a
is
lot of,
something, man.
yeah, so it's a lot of civilians that work there. But I mean, as far as the military side go, I kind of, you know, in the beginning, it bothered me about their standards, but then I was like, you know what? I can just take this negative and make it into a positive with all my experience, and I could talk to these young airmen, and
Yeah.
try to motivate them a little bit more than what they are, because I'll tell you right now, they have no mentorship whatsoever going on with them.
Mm.
Uh, yeah, like we used to have, mentorship program that don't exist.
Well, I
Uh,
think it's because, to be honest with you, I think people got to be to the point where they were afraid to
yeah,
share their personal opinions,
yeah,
right? Or to hold someone to a standard. On mentorship program, to your point, the best way I found, 'cause I made that program on my ship work. But I let the kids, I let the sailors pick
hmm,
their own mentors,
right,
right? I didn't let the mentors pick their own people, but everyone had
yeah,
to have a mentor. But I think the most important thing is they got to trust that the person that wants to mentor them is going to give them good information. And then the young person has got to want to be mentored, right?
right, right,
And so you got to remind them, like, why did you join, bro? Like, why did you leave home? What are you doing here? You
yeah,
know, they forget about that, especially when they're
yeah,
living somewhere like in a base. I mean, the Air Force, I think, is a little different of a culture too, right? Because they're always on bases. They're not really going to
uh,
be like on a ship.
yeah, yeah. Well, and I'm at Fort Sam Houston, which is traditional Army base. However, we are joint base Fort Sam Houston, Lackland, Randolph, and Fort Sam. So
Yeah.
there's an Air Force general in charge at Fort Sam Houston.
And there's still a big Navy presence there too, right? Because you got like the MAA school
Well, that's at Lackland.
that's at Lackland.
Yeah, yeah. At Fort
Is the
Sam,
corpsman there?
huh?
Is the corpsman there at that school or at that base?
Yeah, they combine all the medical, and it's all at Fort Sam now. So the Air Force, the Navy, and the Army, all of their medical schools is at Fort Sam Houston. So yeah.
Okay. Well, hey man, I hope this furlough thing don't last much longer, bro, and they get y'all back to getting your checks and all that, and hopefully it's no, they just busy
Yeah. Yeah.
playing reindeer games up there, bro.
Oh yeah, yeah,
Crazy,
yeah,
crazy. All right,
yeah.
Brian, we're gonna go ahead and land this thing, dog. I got
All
a
right.
few questions for you. We're gonna kind of just get through this, and we're gonna call it a day. All right, you ready?
All right.
All right. Do you remember that first moment where you're like, "Oh my God, I'm really in the Navy"? Like, do you remember when that hit you? Was it in boot camp or was it on the ship?
No, I probably when I went to MEPS. At that point, I knew it was real.
Okay. When you got that background check, huh?
Yeah, yeah.
All right. Hey, Brian, what do you see as one of the biggest leadership challenges you've encountered throughout your life? Right? Do you see one or two that are just consistent?
I would say the biggest leadership challenge is probably when you got to deal with. Uh, I'll just say when you're a chief or senior chief, and you got a whole bunch of chiefs, and that that everybody got their own different opinion of what's going on and how things should be ran, but you're the person in charge. You know,
Yeah,
I think that's a big challenge right there.
it
One of the
is.
biggest. Yeah.
Uh, Nothing harder than Chief and Chiefs, man. How did you find a way to get through that?
To get through the, well, you just got to reach out and get to those, what I would call problem, uh the ones that had the problems, and you just got to make sure that they see the big picture and see what's going on,
Okay.
and get them on board with, you know hey, this is what we got to do to get through this. This is what we got to do to take care of our people. And one thing I try to get through to most of the chiefs at ATG is, hey, when you're going out to the ship to do our inspection, uh, keep in mind that that chief on the ship has a lot of things going on. He got a lot of problems that he probably dealing with personnel wise. Sure,
Yeah.
we're not there to hand him the inspection, but where you can reach in and do a little training, do that, because remember, you're not gonna be at ATG forever. You might be going back out to the fleet. You know what I'm saying?
And
And
that chief might be coming to ATG,
yeah,
and you might got a problem
yeah,
because we've seen that before. No,
right,
that's great mentorship, bro. And the
yeah,
other thing is, if you could find those problem people and turn them the right way, they're
yeah,
almost always leaders,
right,
right?
right,
It's so that's that force multiplying thing that you do so well is you get the right people to start rowing the right direction, and everyone else just follows them, and it's, then away you go, right?
right,
And I'll tell you, those are the skills that make people very effective CMCs,
right.
right? It's happening because as a CMC, you're in charge of everything. You're responsible for everything and in charge of nothing,
Nothing.
right?
Right.
And that's hard, bro. It's
Right.
not an easy job at all. All right.
Yeah.
As a dad, you've now got adult children. What are some of your, a lot of my students listen to this podcast, their parents listen to the podcast. Uh, I'm a dad of a 17-year-old son and an 11-year-old son. What's some of the best advice you would give to parents as they raise their teenagers?
I would tell the parents, hey, take the time out, and you know, listen to your kids, talk to your kids, and find out what motivates them and what is it going to take to get them to the level of success that they want to achieve. Uh, and also, be mindful of what your kids are doing, outside of the home. Because I can tell you right now, one of my jobs is I do background checks on people that want to come onto the base. And we have a list of disqualifiers that will keep you from coming on the base. Give you an example. A marijuana charge. It's nothing out in town that will keep you from, getting a job out in town. But we have a 10-year time frame on that charge. So if you get a marijuana charge in 2017, you can't come on a federal installation for 10 years from that date.
Yeah.
You can't even get a job. So just kind of be in their business a little bit, but not controlling their business, but just keep in mind that there's a small thing like that could keep you from, if you're trying to pursue federal, it's not going to happen.
Nope, that's a good piece of advice, bro. And you got to be aware. I had a student of mine. Uh, I've watched this kid go from being a freshman to a senior, and his first 2 years, he was tough, man. So tough that I didn't even want to come back to my ROTC program the third year, and
Mm,
I made his parents get involved and advocate for him to come back because I felt like he wasn't going to do good. And then he came back and he did really good, but he was still in the streets, still doing things he didn't need to be doing. We'd always be talking about it. And just this week, they came and picked him up from the school with a felony charge, and he is in the big man jail. Right?
mm,
You're not you 18, bro. You're not a little
mm.
baby no more.
Maybe more, yeah.
You in the big man jail. And as many times I might never see him again now, right? Because
Right.
he's not gonna come back to high school.
Yeah.
And it breaks my heart because I put a lot of time in with
Time.
him.
Yeah.
And I've got, I got about 200 students. But for him to have had 3.5 years with me, but he just would not stay
Not the
out the
same.
street,
Treat.
right? Like
Right. Right.
he just wouldn't do it. He'd be good in school, good in class. And he had just recently this week, the recruiters told me they had disqualified him from joining the army because of his arrest records.
Right.
And I've been telling him that for his whole high school time. Like, bro, the military probably not gonna be it. You need to look at going to tech school, get a trade, but you need to
Right.
stay out of trouble. Like you
Trouble.
got to stay
Yeah.
out of trouble Now he locked up,
Yeah.
right? And it's
Yeah.
really real,
Yeah.
and it's sad, man. And
Yeah.
but this has been like that since we were kids,
Right.
right? Like, thank God we joined the military and got out of our own way. But even
Right.
then, you got lucky you didn't get thrown in a Tijuana jail that one day, right? Like,
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
hey, yeah. Okay. How can veterans best leverage their years of experience in the civilian sector, bro? I think you could speak to that because you got 17 years now out of the Navy. How did that best help you be successful post service?
Yeah. I would just say, everything that I gained as far as, leadership, uh, d- uh, dealing with people, taking care of people, um, that translates over to the civilian sector, especially in the federal service. Everything I learned over my 22 years in the Navy um, really is helping me be successful where I'm at right now. Because right now, where I'm at, I'm looked upon for guidance and leadership from most of the senior people that's in the command,
Right.
at my command. So, and they always come and they value the opinion that I have as far as what works, what doesn't work, and how we can move forward with any new changes.
Yeah.
So,
That's
yeah,
awesome. And I think the other thing is it's not as scary as people think it is to retire, to get out,
right,
right?
right,
Like people get really nervous about that, but it's really not that scary. I think the hardest part for me is, which thank God the job that I chose to do, I still get to be Master Chief and I still get to wear the uniform and work with the
inform,
kids.
right,
But then it's like it's not as serious, right? It's not as
right.
critical, and it's not the end of the world if we don't do good at. I mean, I'm more worried about their grades than I'm worried about the way they look in their uniform. You know what I'm saying?
Right,
Like
right.
at the end of the day, I want you to be a good student and be a
So,
good kid and not get in trouble.
right,
Vice being worried about if you're going to join the military and be an AJ squared away sailor or whatever. I'm not a recruiter. That's why I tell people I'm not a recruiter. So,
right.
okay, let's get out of kind of the heavy stuff. Let's get a little more fast stuff. It's Saturday night. We're underway on the ship. Are you looking forward to pizza or wings?
Wings.
Wings. All right. All right, brother. I need somebody to go clean the berthing or I need somebody in the working party. Which one do you want?
I'm gonna send you on down to the birthing or the working party. Well, I'm gonna send you to the birthing because the XO coming through there.
All right, you want the berthing. Got it. Okay. I appreciate the priority for sure. And we're going to watch a movie in the Chiefs mess. Would you rather watch a De Niro movie or a Pacino movie?
Pacino.
Pacino, okay. Looking back on your career, what was your favorite duty station?
Favorite? I'm gonna have to go with ATG.
Okay. And that was
Yeah.
a pinnacle one, right? That would have been tough to beat, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah, for sure. I mean, you was definitely calling shots at ATG. Okay. Um, looking back on your career, what was your favorite Liberty port?
Australia.
Okay. That's a good one for sure. What was the hardest or the most difficult qualification you ever had to achieve?
Mm, I would say I can't even think of the name of it now. It wasn't the EI, but we had to learn how to work the man. I can't even
Was
think
it
of the name
EPSI?
of it, Gary. Yeah, there we go.
EPSI?
Yeah,
So the console
the
there at CCS.
console. Yeah.
Yep, got it. Yep. Okay. So if you had somebody that you were talking to, or if you had to choose, would you rather choose overseas duty or stateside duty? Because you did both. Which one would you
Hmm.
prefer to do if you did it again?
Overseas.
Oh, overseas it could be simple, right? It could be simple.
Hmm.
Yeah, that's why I did a lot of my seat time overseas, bro. Just that commute, it's a
Yeah,
5 minute, it's a 10-minute walk from the barracks or the building to the
yeah,
ship,
yeah.
right? You have a favorite movie series, Brian?
Movie series. I'm gonna tell you right now, I'm not a big TV watcher. I was
Okay,
back in the day, but if I had to choose one, I would probably go with the Superman.
okay.
Yeah.
So if you don't watch a lot of TV, what do you do with your time? You reading? You working on hobbies?
Yeah, I do woodworking.
Yep. Okay.
Yeah.
Cracking.
Yeah,
You have
my
a business,
garage
right, with woodworking?
my garage is my shop.
What kind of stuff do you make?
Man, I do cutting boards, charcuterie boards. Um, I build tables. Yeah.
Do you have a website for your business?
No, I have a business. It's a hobby.
Just a hobby.
Yeah,
Okay.
just a
Okay.
hobby. I do it. I do it for fun. Just a hobby to keep me occupied.
Okay. All right, Brian, would you rather be independent or on a team?
Team is better.
Team is better. Okay. Do you have a personal leadership philosophy?
Take care of those under you so that they will be successful in your success.
Okay. Take care of those under you. They'll be successful in your success. Got it. All right. So in the Navy, in the Chiefs mess, we got some guiding principles, right? We got deck plate leadership, institutional technical experts, professionalism, character, loyalty, active communication, and a sense of heritage. Out of those principles, which one is your favorite?
I'm gonna have to go with communication because that depends on hey, if you can communicate well, then you can get people to do what you want. But if you're not a good communicator, then you may lose some people in the background.
Critical, bro. Communication is almost always one of the root causes to people failing in leadership, right?
Yeah.
They just can't communicate. All right, Brian, would you rather lead or follow?
I'm gonna be a leader.
I'm not surprised. All right, Brian, that's it, man. You have any saved rounds or alibis?
No, I mean, hey, it was good to be here. Good catching up. And I just hope for those that's watching that they can take something from all of your podcasts and apply it to their lives so that, one day they can be successful and they can help people out, get to the next level.
That's it, man. Thank you so much for sharing your story. Brian, thank you so much for taking care of me and my family. Bro, without a doubt, you played a pivotal role in my career. There's 3 people that I really give the props to, and you are in that 3 people
All
because
right.
you took care of me when I needed someone to take care of me. Because I'll go do it. I'll go to work. But every
Right.
once in a while, you need some help. and that was you. And so I will always thank God for putting you in my path. And if you ever need anything, you please, and if I can help, you let me know. Okay.
All right. All right.
All right, brother. I appreciate your time, man. I'm gonna talk to you later. And
All
I hope
right,
you have a
Gary.
great rest of the weekend.
All right. You too.
Yes, sir. Talk to you later. Bye.
All right.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
And I know I was born for this. I know I was born for this. Don't care for the critics, my words are like physics, a force that they can't stop. They just don't get it, I think they forget I'm not done till I'm on top. I know